Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us
Glad
today.
to be here.
And today we're going to be looking at some writings from Ellen G. White.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, so specifically, um, we're going to be taking a look at spiritual gifts,
Okay.
and we're going to be,
Several volumes of that.
several volumes. Yeah, and
Yeah.
we're going to be going through and really kind of picking out some of the main points and talking about it a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, her writings are always so rich and so full of
Yeah,
symbolism and meaning and, you know,
yeah. And so I
you can find new things every time you read them.
it's a great point, and I think that I think it's really fascinating because um, you know, these books, spiritual gifts, it's not just a theological treatise. It's a lot of personal accounts and visions and things that are very, uh,
Right.
vivid and also, pretty pointed criticisms of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating how she blends those personal experiences with these broader societal and theological themes. You get a real sense of her own spiritual journey, her doubts, her convictions, and then you see how those experiences shaped her understanding of things like social justice and theological debates.
Well, let's start with her early life, because I think that to really understand the impact of White's later work, it's helpful to understand where she came from.
For sure.
And what's really striking to me is that as a young woman, she was really seeking spiritual fulfillment.
Absolutely.
And, she initially kind of, found some hope in Methodist class meetings.
Right.
You're looking for connection, looking for a deeper understanding of her faith.
It wasn't quite what she was looking for.
It wasn't quite it. Yeah. And, there's this one passage where she's interacting with an elder in the Methodist church.
Right.
And he's questioning her fervent belief in the second coming.
Interesting.
Yeah. And,
Some real perspectives there.
totally different perspectives because she yearns for an end to sin, and she's very much looking forward to complete sanctification.
Right.
And he's saying, no, there's good that can be done by living a long life here on earth.
Yeah, it's interesting how that early experience really seems to highlight a core theme that runs throughout her work, and that is the urgency of preparing for the end times. For her, the Second Coming wasn't some distant event. It was a reality that demanded immediate attention and preparation.
And it's right after this period of time where she's wrestling with these big theological questions
Right.
that she has her first vision.
Wow. What a life-changing experience.
I know, and the way she describes it is so vivid.
It is.
It's like she's, sending to heaven
Yeah.
with 144,000 people, witnessing the judgment, receiving crowns and harps. I
It's
mean,
like stepping right into a painting,
it's just incredible.
full of this rich symbolic imagery and deep spiritual meaning.
And you can't forget the heavenly sanctuary.
Yes, of course.
She goes into detail about the two apartments, the ark, the censer,
Right.
the angels guarding the tree of life,
Mm.
the glory surrounding Jesus. And, she even talks about the fragrance of incense representing the prayers of the saints.
Beautiful imagery.
It's really powerful stuff.
It's clear that these visions weren't just fleeting moments for her. They really became foundational to her understanding of God's salvation and the future. They fueled her desire to share these insights with others, leading her to a life of writing and ministry.
And that's a great point. And speaking of ministry, her work with healing is particularly compelling.
Yes, it is.
The story of Sister Frances Howland being instantly healed from rheumatic fever through prayer is just remarkable.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of belief, both for the person being healed and for those offering prayers.
Absolutely. But this ministry wasn't without its critics.
That's right.
We start seeing accusations of fanaticism popping up, particularly in Maine. And she's very vocal about these individuals who she believes are relying on what she calls unreliable impressions and burdens that lead to corruption.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that spiritual movements often attract a wide range of interpretations and practices, some of which can be very controversial. It's fascinating to see how she navigated those complexities, even within groups that shared her broader beliefs.
And let's not forget about the practical challenges that she and her husband faced in publishing this work.
Oh,
Financial struggles,
yeah.
her husband's declining health.
I've read.
I mean, talk about a test of faith.
Absolutely, but it's through those trials that their commitment to spreading their message really shines through, their journey to Waterbury in a freezing open sleigh, while also facing accusations of financial impropriety. It's just a testament to their resilience.
It makes you wonder, what was it about their message that made all of this hardship worth it?
Right. What kept them going?
Ex
Well, a big part of it seems to have been her deep concern for the state of society. She really didn't shy away from tackling those tough issues, and her condemnation of slavery is particularly striking.
it's very powerful. She pulls no punches.
No, she doesn't.
Comparing the actions of slave owners to the cruelty of papists and heathens toward early Christians.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really powerful indictment, especially considering the historical context.
Absolutely. And she didn't limit her social commentary to just one issue. Her views on intemperance in eating and drinking are also worth noting.
Yeah, it's not just about avoiding alcohol.
Right.
It's really about the overall impact of unhealthy habits on spiritual well-being.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how she saw that connection between physical health and spiritual growth.
It's a theme that resonates even today as more and more people recognize the interconnectedness of our physical, mental, and spiritual well-being.
And then there's her critique of contemporary fashion trends.
Right, those extravagant clothing choices.
Yeah, and she sees it as a sign of worldliness and a departure from modesty.
It's interesting to consider how our outward appearance reflects our inner values.
Yeah, if you connect that to the bigger picture, it's like she's really concerned about separating oneself from the influences of the world, whether that's through, behavior beliefs or even outward appearance.
It's about being in the world, but not of the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to some of the more controversial aspects of her work.
Yeah, we were going to get there.
The theological debates and her views on spiritual gifts.
Right, her take on spiritual gifts is particularly interesting. She draws from 1 Corinthians 12.28 to support her belief that these gifts continue to exist within the church. She directly challenges those who believed that they had ceased.
It's a bold stance, especially for her time.
It is.
But it shows how willing she was to challenge these established theological norms and encourage people to examine the scriptures for themselves.
Yeah, and that questioning spirit seems to be a hallmark of her approach to a lot of theological topics. Take her advocacy for Sabbath observance, for example.
Yeah.
She goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, arguing that they observed the Sabbath even after the fall.
Yeah, it really highlights how deeply she rooted her beliefs in the biblical narrative,
Absolutely.
drawing connections across different periods of history to support her interpretations.
And her perspective on the nature of death is another example of her willingness to challenge traditional views. She rejects the concept of eternal suffering in hell,
Yeah.
attributing that belief to Satan's deception. Instead, she emphasizes the stark reality of death itself. No pain, no joy, no hatred. It's a very different take on the afterlife than what many traditional Christian denominations taught.
And that perspective ties back to her focus on the end times and the importance of preparation.
Right.
It's not about escaping eternal torment, but about being ready for Christ's second coming and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth.
Exactly, and that's something that we'll delve into even further as we continue this deep dive.
Yeah. And, go through this first part. What really stood out to me was her courage to challenge the status quo,
I agree.
both within the church and in society at large.
She was definitely a woman ahead of her time.
Yeah. And the depth and breadth of her writings, even just in these excerpts, it really makes me want to dive deeper into her work.
I agree. There's so much more to unpack here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay. Sounds good.
So stay tuned, folks. This journey into the world of Ellen G. White is just getting started.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the writings of Ellen G. White as we continue to explore these excerpts from Spiritual Gifts.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see how she envisioned the end times,
Mm-hmm.
not as this sudden event, but as this gradual intensification of the conflict between good and evil.
And she doesn't shy away from painting some pretty vivid pictures of what that conflict might look like.
I know, she's just not.
There's one scene where she's describing the plagues falling upon the earth, and you have some people cursing God while others are begging for guidance.
It's intense.
Yeah, it is.
It's a very stark depiction of the choices people would face as the end drew near. But amidst all that chaos, there's another group, the ones who heeded those warnings, who purified their lives and remained united in their faith. They stand firm, they're ready for Christ's return.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Even those who are preparing weren't entirely free from error.
Right.
White talks about how God is using these repeated warnings and messages to refine his people to help them root out any lingering falsehoods or misconceptions.
Yeah, she seems to suggest that true faith isn't static. It's not just this one-time decision.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of purification and growth.
You're constantly learning and growing.
Exactly. And that process involves actively rejecting any belief or practice that doesn't align with God's revealed will.
And she even links these errors to influences from like heathens and papists.
Right.
It's language that reflects her belief in a very distinct and separate path for those who follow God's truth.
Absolutely.
So for her, it wasn't enough to simply believe.
You had to live it.
Yeah, you had to live it.
You have to constantly examine your heart, your actions, your motives.
Aligning your actions with God's will.
Exactly. And she uses this really powerful analogy. She says, when those sins which God hates are subdued, Jesus will come in and sup with you, and you with him.
It's a beautiful image.
It is, and it points to a level of intimacy with God that goes beyond just intellectual assent or emotional displays.
It's about that deep personal connection.
Exactly.
And this focus on inner purity isn't just about individual salvation.
Right.
She's very critical of those whose lukewarm faith hinders the true believers.
She compares them to a continual weight.
Yeah.
Even a stumbling block to unbelievers.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that complacency within the church
It is.
could be as detrimental as outright opposition to the truth.
Absolutely. She
Mhm.
seems to be saying that our actions and attitudes have ripple effects. They impact not only our own spiritual journey, but also the faith of others.
And speaking of opposition, White delves into this fascinating idea that Satan has shifted his tactics.
Ooh.
He moves away from this kind of overt persecution
Right.
to these more subtle forms of
A
deception.
little bit more sneaky.
Yeah, much sneakier.
Yeah, she talks about Satan corrupting the doctrines of the Bible and using traditions to lead people astray.
Wow.
It's almost as if he realized that brute force wasn't working, so he opted for a more insidious approach,
Undermining people's faith slowly.
slowly eroding people's understanding of God's truth.
Yeah, and she describes how Satan might tempt church members to focus on worldly gain,
Right.
using this excuse of supporting the cause
To justify their
to
actions.
justify their pursuit of wealth and possessions.
It's a chilling thought,
It is.
this idea of a subtle infiltration even within the church itself.
It really makes you think about the motivations behind people's actions.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point, the danger of hypocrisy. It's so easy to cloak those selfish desires in spiritual language.
It is. It happens all the time.
It does. And White reminds us to look beyond those outward actions and really examine the true motivations of the heart.
And she gets very specific about this, calling out those who, add farm to farm and land to land and house to house.
While neglecting their spiritual duties,
Yeah.
their priorities are out of whack.
Exactly. It's interesting how she contrasts those who cling to their possessions
Right.
with those who give freely and sacrificially. Remember that line, God loveth a cheerful giver.
It's powerful, isn't it?
It is. It's a reminder that true generosity isn't just about what you give.
It's about the attitude behind it.
Yeah, where's your heart?
Exactly.
And she connects this generosity directly to the concept of laying up treasure in heaven. It's like she's saying by clinging to earthly possessions, you risk losing sight of the true riches that await in God's kingdom.
It's about shifting your perspective.
Yeah, I know bringing up money and possessions can get uncomfortable,
It can.
especially in a religious context.
Yeah, but White doesn't shy away from it.
No, she doesn't.
She sees it as a fundamental test of faith.
Where does your trust lie?
Exactly. If you truly believe that God will provide for your needs, then you shouldn't fear letting go of your material wealth. And in fact, holding on to it might be a sign that you don't fully trust in God's promises.
It's a challenging perspective for sure.
It is.
One that forces us to confront our own relationship with money and possessions.
Absolutely.
And this theme of sacrifice goes beyond just, financial giving.
Right.
She talks about how those who possess physical strength but lack material wealth can still contribute significantly to God's work.
They can choose to deny themselves in many ways, can lay out less upon their bodies, and to gratify their appetite, and find much to spare the cause and lay up in heaven a treasure.
It's a reminder that sacrifice isn't limited to those with financial means.
Right.
It's a mindset.
It's a willingness to put God first.
Yeah, to prioritize God's work over your own personal comfort and gratification.
And this commitment to God's work is so beautifully illustrated in the story of her husband feeling compelled to write and publish the present truth, even though they were penniless.
Yeah, and despite his initial doubts,
Right.
they decided to walk out by faith.
trusting that God would provide.
Yeah, and that decision led them through some incredibly difficult experiences.
For sure.
And their journey to Topsham, where they healed Sister Frances Howland, really highlights their unwavering commitment.
To fulfilling their calling.
Exactly. And it's worth noting how White's own health struggles became intertwined with their ministry.
Yeah.
She speaks openly about her physical weakness and reliance on God's strength to carry on the work.
And those challenges only intensified as they traveled and encountered opposition, sometimes even from within their own ranks.
Yeah, the incident with NAH, who accused them of financial impropriety despite their generosity toward him, it's just a reminder that internal conflict can be just as damaging as external opposition.
Absolutely. It's a sad but important reminder that even within a community of believers, there can be jealousy, suspicion, and a lack of understanding. And this brings us to another key theme in White's writings, the importance of unity among believers.
Yeah, she seems particularly concerned about those who claim to have the truth but stand separate from the body of Sabbath keepers.
Right, sowing discord and division.
Yeah. Remember that passage where she describes those who believe that God is only with the very few, the very scattered, and whose influence is to tear down and scatter?
And the work that God's servants are building up.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
It is, and it's like she's saying that true unity isn't just about agreeing on a set of doctrines.
It's about working together.
Yeah.
Supporting one another and recognizing that God can work through a collective body of believers, not just isolated individuals.
And this emphasis on unity ties back to her warnings about the dangers of worldliness. The need to maintain a clear distinction between God's people and those who follow the ways of the world.
Right. It's about creating a space where faith can flourish,
Yeah.
where believers can support each other and stand firm against the pressures of the world.
But this call to separation doesn't equate to isolation.
Right.
She emphasizes the importance of engaging with the world, of sharing the truth, of working to bring others into the fold.
Exactly. It's not about building walls. It's about being a beacon of light.
Remember the story of how she and her husband shared their faith with Brother B's family?
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of how genuine compassion and a willingness to share your beliefs can plant seeds of truth in the hearts of others.
Absolutely. But this outreach isn't always easy.
No.
She talks about encountering a great amount of unbelief and facing accusations of financial impropriety even after demonstrating remarkable generosity.
Yeah. It's a reminder that sharing your faith can sometimes lead to rejection, misunderstanding, even persecution. But White persevered. She traveled extensively. She endured hardship to reach as many people as possible.
And her dedication to this work extended beyond preaching and teaching.
Right.
She had this holistic approach to well-being, addressing physical health and social issues alongside spiritual matters.
Absolutely. Her strong stance against slavery is a prime example. She didn't just see it as a political issue.
Right.
She viewed it as a moral abomination, a direct violation of God's principles of love and justice.
And her views on health and temperance were equally compelling.
They were.
She saw a clear connection between physical well-being and spiritual clarity, advocating for simple natural remedies and warning against the dangers of overindulgence.
It's a perspective that resonates even today with growing concerns about overmedication and the potential harms of relying too heavily on pharmaceuticals.
And her approach to child-rearing is another fascinating area to explore.
It is.
She emphasizes the importance of discipline, respect for authority, and a clear distinction between right and wrong.
Remember that part where she criticizes parents who are in subjection to their children, fearing to cross their wills, and allowing them to dictate the course of the family.
It's a stark contrast to some modern parenting trends
It is.
that often emphasize permissiveness and a child-centered approach.
But White's emphasis on discipline isn't about harshness or control.
No.
It's about guiding children towards righteousness,
Right.
instilling in them a strong moral compass, and preparing them to stand firm against the temptations of the world.
And this preparation is crucial, especially as the end times draw near.
Absolutely. She believes that young people will face unprecedented challenges to their faith, and they need a solid foundation to withstand the onslaught of deception and temptation.
But this preparation isn't solely the responsibility of parents.
Right.
She calls upon ministers and church leaders to play an active role in guiding and supporting young people.
Providing them with sound biblical teaching and a strong sense of community.
It takes a village, as they say.
It does, and it's important to acknowledge the specific dangers that young people face even within a faith community.
Hmm.
She talks about the corrupting influence of bad company, the temptations of the flesh, and the tendency to disregard the wisdom and counsel of older generations.
These are timeless challenges that resonate with every generation.
They are. It's a sobering reminder of the pressures that young people face. But amidst these warnings, White also offers hope.
Hmm.
She believes that young people, when grounded in faith and surrounded by a supportive community,
Yeah.
can become powerful agents of change, shining their light in a world that desperately needs it.
It's a message that resonates deeply with those who see the potential in young people and believe they have a vital role to play in shaping the future.
So we've covered quite a bit of ground in this part of our deep dive, exploring White's views on everything from end-time events and spiritual preparation to social issues and family dynamics.
What's truly fascinating is how she weaves all these seemingly disparate topics into a cohesive worldview, one that emphasizes a clear distinction between the ways of God and the ways of the world, the importance of personal purity and unity among believers, and the urgent need to prepare for the coming of Christ.
It's a worldview that challenges us to examine our own beliefs, our motivations, and our priorities.
And as we head into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the most compelling and thought-provoking elements of this worldview, considering how it might inform our understanding of the world and our place within it. Stick with us. There's so much more to unpack. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Ellen G. White. It's been a whirlwind of visions and social critiques and end-time prophecies.
It has. And in this final part, I want to focus on some of the subtler yet incredibly powerful themes woven throughout these excerpts from Spiritual Gift. These are the threads that connect her seemingly disparate ideas into a coherent worldview.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of threads are we talking about?
Well, consider her repeated references to the concept of a peculiar people.
Okay,
It's a phrase that pops up often in the Bible, usually describing those set apart for God's purposes.
right. And White seems to really embrace this idea.
She does.
She talks about believers needing a distinct identity, separating themselves from the world's influences. But it's not just about outward appearances, is it?
Exactly. It's a fundamental difference in values,
Yeah.
priorities, even ways of thinking.
Yeah.
She critiques those who adopt worldly philosophies, seeking power and fulfillment within themselves instead of looking to God.
It's like she's saying true spirituality requires a complete mind transformation,
Yes.
aligning your thoughts and desires with God's will. It's not just about saying you believe, it's about living it out.
And this transformation ties directly back to that theme of preparation for the end times. It's not passive waiting. It's actively shaping your life, your character, even your community to reflect the values of God's kingdom.
This preparation also has a strong communal aspect. White emphasizes unity among believers, a shared commitment to God's truth and supporting each other when things get tough.
Right. Remember that passage where she describes those who heeded the warnings and purified their lives? They faced the trials of the end times with peace, joy, and unwavering confidence in God's protection. It's a picture of what true community can be, especially in the midst of chaos.
But it's not a community that hides from the world, right? White still talks about sharing the truth, showing compassion, and working to make a positive impact.
Absolutely. It's not about building walls, but about being a light. The story of healing Sister Frances Howland wasn't just a private miracle.
Right.
It was a public display of God's power, drawing others to the truth.
So it's a balancing act, separating from the world's negativity while still engaging with it to share hope and truth. That seems challenging, to say the least.
It is. It requires constant discernment and a willingness to challenge both complacency within the church and the injustices of the world. White navigated the complexities of her time with conviction and purpose, and her example can guide us today.
Her writings offer a compelling vision of what it means to be a peculiar people.
A community set apart for God, committed to both personal transformation and making a real difference in the world.
It's a vision that speaks to the longing in many hearts for a life of purpose and meaning. It challenges us to examine our own beliefs, motivations, and priorities.
So where do we go from here?
Right. How do we embody these principles in our own lives, communities, and interactions with the world?
That's the question we each need to grapple with. Seeking guidance from the scriptures, learning from those who have gone before us, and listening to the Holy Spirit.
It's a lifelong journey, a process of growth and refinement. It's not always easy, but it's worth it.
And I think that's the true gift of Ellen G. White's legacy. Her writings offer insights, challenges, and a deeper understanding of what it means to live a life of faith in a complex world. It transcends time and speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
Going through these excerpts has sparked a real desire to dive deeper into White's work.
I encourage you to do just that. Explore her writings, grapple with her ideas, and let them inspire you on your own spiritual journey.
And folks, the conversation doesn't end here. Join us next time for another deep dive where we'll continue exploring fascinating topics and delve into the depths of human knowledge and experience.
Until then, keep those minds curious, those hearts open, and keep seeking truth in all its forms.